sretna pod suncem, rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, rukom partije i pod srcem dika. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dika. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem kita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ
до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome along. It is the morning of the 29th of October, and the year is, of course, 2024. And we're coming to you today with two live streams, this being the first of them, and we'll be back with one at about 7:30 this evening, where we'll be looking at the latest from West Asia. So, this morning we'll be looking at the recent parliamentary elections in Georgia and what this means. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the history here, I will briefly outline what's going on. Georgia, of course, a very ancient place in many respects, but former Soviet republic, the birthplace, of course, of the great Joseph Stalin. One of the areas in one of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union that had what I would call a bad petty bourgeois nationalist problem, which ultimately, following the total implosion of the Soviet government's authority caused by the counter-revolution led by Gorbachev, the Georgian population were one of those that actually, even in the referendum of March 1991, backed breaking away from the Soviet Union. Now, they did so with a load of promises made by a bunch of intellectuals who, ironically enough, had led a pretty decent life in the Soviet Union. A bunch of poets and writers who would spend all their time romanticizing the Georgian, supposedly the amazing life led by Georgians in the past when it was an independent kingdom. You know, obviously the intellectuals never look at the life of the serfs, only those of the lords. So the Georgian independence that it did emerge was always truncated because immediately following 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of Georgia, it immediately fell into a 2-year civil war following the removal of the first president and then the breakaway of Abkhazia region in the northwest of the country, and a familiar pattern in the 1990s of countries disintegrating, long-standing civil wars being waged, and you've now got a situation in Georgia where, even though there's a formal peace in Abkhazia itself has essentially been a breakaway region for over 30 years. This was followed by South Ossetia, the South Ossetians aligning themselves with the Russians. And this was, of course, part of what caused the 2008 Georgian War, the breakaway of South Ossetia and the attempts to forcibly reconquer it by the Georgian government. But back to the 90s for a moment, and thankfully not in a Britpop sense, the Georgian government that emerges in the 90s is led by a crook by the name of Eduard Shevardnadze. You may have heard of him. Former Soviet foreign minister, architect of much of the counter-revolutionary activities of Gorbachev, is the guy who orchestrated the series of capitulations after 1985, which ultimately culminated in the counter-revolution of 1989 to 91. Now, Shevardnadze is, of course, was for a while beloved in the West because he was the architect of many of these capitulations. And it is funny to see just how quickly his old friends turned on him, because he became Georgian president in the mid-90s and then essentially tried to do a balancing act. He tried to, on the one hand, work with his old friends in the West, and on the other hand, retain positive relations with the Russians to a degree. Now, this makes a great deal of sense. If you look at Georgia's geographical location, just go and look up Georgia on a map, you can see that the Europe, as in the economic centers of the European Union, isn't exactly conveniently positioned to do a lot of trade with Georgia. Like Russia is very conveniently positioned, as are bigger nations such as Turkey, or even if you go through Armenia or Azerbaijan, you could even trade with the very large nation to the south, which is Iran. So integration into Europe doesn't really make a great deal of sense, given the Georgian commodities, Georgia, especially like Georgian agricultural commodities. I mean, are going to be more readily tradable with countries close by. This is a very, very basic thing. But what emerges in the 1990s is, of course, the very large amount of investment done by principally the US, the French, the Germans, and other European countries through funds and institutions organized by the EU in the so-called civil society operations in Georgia. Now, if you've observed the history of the last 20 to 30 years, you will know what this means, which is that following the collapse of the USSR and following the counter-revolution, which destroyed all elements of the former working class intelligentsia that did exist for a long time in the USSR, what emerged instead was a wholly petty bourgeois intelligentsia in these nations, not just Georgia, but Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states, Azerbaijan to a degree, though that's a bit of a different situation, but certainly Armenia. And is that the intelligentsia that emerges there is almost wholly reactionary. So let's just take a brief digression and talk about like the Russian and wider sort of Tsarist empire space intelligentsia in the 19th century. Now, those in the 19th century who were considered to be the intelligentsia in Tsarist Russia, a lot of them were attracted to, at the time, what were regarded as revolutionary Western ideas. So you had various strains of liberalism, constitutional liberalism, that ultimately formed in the old Tsarist period the Cadet Party under Pavel Milyukov. You have various different forms of anarchism, various different forms of socialism. You have, of course, Bakunin and his boys roving around the place. You have, of course, the foundations of the Marxist groups in Tsarist Russia. All these ideas, well, many of them came or inspired by progressive events in the West. And this, of course, is satirized by the romantic reactionary Dostoevsky and brothers Karamazov. But at that time, all of the ideas coming from the West were of a progressive nature when you compared it to the deeply reactionary and backward-looking Tsarist regime. Now, fast forward to the 1990s, and again, an intelligentsia emerges which looks to the West for its ideas. Let's ask the question, what's the difference? It seems maybe the answer is obvious to you, but I think it's worth exploring, because the difference between the 19th century and the late 20th and early 21st is, of course, that those who were inspired by Western ideas in Tsarist Russia in the mid to late 19th century were inspired by a period in European history, Western European history, that was generally progressive. And I mean progressive in the sense that society progressed during that period, from the American Revolution through to like the revolutions of the 1848, when the limits of the bourgeois revolutions in Europe became obvious, as Marx chronicled in books like The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and the Civil War in France. You reach the limits of bourgeois so-called reform and bourgeois revolutions in the later 1840s with the revolutions then. And then after that, you go into ultimately go into the imperialist period in the later 19th century. But the point about this is that the ideas coming from the West prior to the imperialist period that made their way into Russia were all coming from a West that was much more progressive, that was actually taking those societies forward. Now, what do we get in the 90s? You get ideas coming from a West that is utterly decayed, that is utterly degenerate, that is no longer taking its own societies forward. I mean, just take a look around, any area of the United States that isn't an elite, wealthy enclave, and you'll see what I mean. Or any area in Britain, really, that's that isn't part of the shrinking, the tiny bourgeois or shrinking petty bourgeois layers. You can see the decay clearly there. So what comes to Georgia and places like all the places in the ex-Soviet states in the 90s is not progressive ideas. It is a wave of rotten ideas coming from an intelligentsia in the West, which is wholly owned and controlled by imperialism. And this is where we get into the discussion of like the interrelatedness of ideas and how these, of course, are derived from material conditions. So ideas from the West in the 1990s are derived from material conditions in the West. And what are the material conditions in the United States, Britain, France, Germany? It is decaying late-stage imperialism. So, meaning the productive base of the economies are being hollowed out, meaning that the working class is being reduced to abject poverty, meaning that the system is basically eating the whole world, or trying to, and ultimately devouring itself, meaning that this is a system with no progressive content left in it by the 1990s. And so the adoption of all the ideas coming from the so-called intelligentsias in the West by the post-Soviet intelligentsia in the East can only be reactionary, because you're adopting ideas coming out of a decaying, rotten system. So how could it be anything else other than a reactionary mess? And that goes for all of these so-called intelligentsias in the East, whether they call themselves fascists and are openly reactionary, or whether they call themselves liberals, or whether they call themselves social democrats. Because a social democrat in Georgia or in Ukraine, who is wedded to the ideas of French, German, British, American social democracy, because there has been American social democracy, it came in the form of FDR's Democrats. Well, what you're adopting, if you're someone in Georgia adopting the ideas coming from Western social democracy, is something which, again, is a wholly reactionary tradition, which is meant to, in its high point, divide the working class by offering reforms, but basically stymie revolutionary progress. And now in the period of total decay, all it offers is fake reforms and essentially acting in partnership with the pro-capitalist parties just to keep imperialism going. And those are the ideas that are coming to Georgia and other ex-Soviet states in the 90s. So and also there is the illusion. We talked on the last live stream about the illusions of victory. So that the illusions of the West, the illusion that the West is unbeatable, that everything here is amazing, that you will have instant wealth the moment you step off a fucking plane, all that kind of stuff, all those lies. So the image of the West as having won the Cold War, it didn't. The other side suffered a disastrous series of acts of treachery which destroyed it. That's not. They gained enormously from the destruction of socialism, but they didn't cause the destruction of socialism. The socialist systems destroyed themselves through their own internal contradictions that they didn't successfully resolve, and so it led to a counter-revolution. So capitalism, even though it has, of course, in its imperialist phase, gained greatly from the destruction of the socialist systems of the East, was not able to correct its uninterrupted downward spiral. And so now we come to the point where we're discussing like Georgia and other, and this applies equally to other nations such as Armenia, Ukraine especially, where you've got all of these intelligentsias getting shitloads of money through the 1990s into the 2000s, building net media and academic networks in all of these ex-Soviet states, which is designed to do really one thing and one thing only, which is to bring over these countries into being essentially vassals of the US-led system. And this is done partially through the EU, partially through NATO. And that's what they had in mind for Georgia. This is behind, ultimately, what's called the Rose Revolution in 2003, 21 years ago now. Now, this was something which took place at about the same time as the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And the objectives in terms of the US and its allies were the same, which is, again, we will have to refer back to our old friend Paul Wolfowitz, who identified containing Russia and making sure it didn't get too powerful as a key objective in the 1992 national security strategy that he wrote up, and which became the blueprint for all of the actions of every American government since then. So it wasn't just that Paul Wolfowitz was some sort of genius, it was just that he was in charge of writing up the priorities in the post-Cold War world, the priorities of the US ruling class. So these ideas all came from think tanks inside the US that were paid for by the big money men inside the US ruling class. And so bringing over Georgia into the column of the United States is a useful thing to have, because you can, of course, have ultimately a military presence there. You can use it to put pressure on the Russians and ultimately surround Russia with US military installations, which is what they've been trying to do for 30 years now. And this was the reason why they backed and the unstable, lunatic and long-time US asset, Mikhail Saakashvili, all the way back in 2003. Now, Saakashvili, of course, comes in, does the usual thing that a US puppet at this stage in the game does, engages in further mass privatizations, tries to get Georgia more firmly aligned with the US by sending Georgian troops to join the US in its gigantic war crime operation in Iraq, and of course loyally creates a war on behalf of the US. Now, this has been stated openly recently by Ivanishvili. Now, Ivanishvili, if you don't know who he is the guy who's the founder of the current ruling party. Guy will come to him in a recent interview that the 2008 war very much was the creation of Saakashvili. Now, to give you a brief overview of the 2008 war, I mentioned South Ossetia earlier. South Ossetia, of course, is a breakaway region, formerly part of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, and it has been in dispute in terms of a dispute with the Georgian government basically ever since independence. And there were Russian peacekeepers there, had been for a long time, and ultimately, due to various conversations that he was having with the Bush administration, the Georgian government, which was again something that was levered into position by the US through a color revolution. Now, this isn't to say, just to pause for a moment, that the prior presidency of Eduard Shevardnadze was any good. Often these regimes aren't. It was just as dominated by oligarchs as the Saakashvili government would be, just as corrupt as the Saakashvili government would be. The only objection the US really had to it was that Shevardnadze was still trying to do a bit of a balancing act between Russia and the United States, and that was unacceptable. So therefore, their old friend had to be overthrown. So the reason why, of course, or one of the reasons why, you get the opposition, or the pro-EU, pro-US opposition manages to get such a turnout for these demonstrations, both in 2003 and more recently, is, of course, that they've spent many years and by this stage, probably billions of dollars, pumping money into Georgia to build up their essentially cadre organizations, to use a term we use in communist parties. The imperialists look to build political cadre for themselves in places like Georgia, meaning people whose job it is to go out and advocate for the line of the US imperialists. Now, these can be people on the right, these can be people nominally on the left, but what matters is ultimately that the line they're giving out leads people back towards supporting political positions which take Georgia into being a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States. Now, this, and if you have a lot of these people and they're trained in organizing demonstrations, mobilizing people, agitating, and you have basically an unlimited budget to do so and no real opposition, yeah, you can build yourself up a political network where you can easily pull out many thousands of people onto the streets and tap into, as they have done in the past, real frustrations and anger that do exist in the Georgian population. Because, of course, post-Soviet independence has not been at all what was promised. In fact, that would be me rather making an understatement, given what happened in Georgia was essentially another version of what happened in places like Ukraine and the Baltic states. Birth rate collapse due to impoverishment of the working class, not quite as much asset stripping and deindustrialization as the Baltic states, I don't think, but certainly a great deal of it, and all the usual social problems that came with the collapse of socialism. So by 2003, there will have been a lot of frustrated and angry people who, following a decade of independence, don't see any material gain for themselves. So it's relatively easy for the US imperialists and their NGO operations in places like Georgia to rile people up and get them out into the streets. And of course, in the manner of all professional paid agitators of imperialism, they pay various different people to be agitators for them. They pay fascists. Remember, there's a lot of Georgian fascists armed and fighting in Ukraine right now. They pay liberals and they pay so-called socialists. This is the operation that they run. You can have 3 different flavors or 4 different flavors of pro-US political figures. You can be a pro-US fascist, you can be a pro-US liberal, you can be a pro-US social democrat, all of which are available to you as long as you do the important thing, which is back up the old stars and stripes when it comes to it. So the 2008 war is the product of the US managing to impose a madman in the form of the tie-eating lunatic Saakashvili into the presidency, who, thinking, following conversations with the Bush administration, that he had their full backing, decides that now's the time in 2008 to launch a war. Now, he did this thinking that, you have to marvel at the idiocy of somebody like Saakashvili to believe for a moment that the US was going to march in right behind him, which they were never going to do. Apparently, I saw an interview on this with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was or had been involved in the Bush administration as an assistant to Secretary of State Powell. And he gave an account that apparently Cheney wanted to bomb a road tunnel that was bringing Russian troops into Georgia over a mountainous road, until he was told that, well, if we do that, Mr. Vice President, basically it's nuclear wartime. And at that point, he decided it wasn't a very good idea. So Saakashvili was hung out to dry by his friends in the United States. Now, one might ask, why on earth did Saakashvili ever think that the US was going to march in behind him? Well, turns out that the investment that the US made in the projecting its image of immortality into these countries did pay off in a way, because it grew a layer of leaders in these countries that did become convinced that the US was not only immortal, but all that the US had to do was to show up, and that the Russians would crumble like a bad meringue. Now, to a certain extent, I can understand where that mentality in people like Saakashvili came from, because this is indeed what had happened. To an extent, with the Gorbachev leadership. The Gorbachev leadership in the Soviet Union, I mean, God knows, I mean, if we rewrote Dante's Inferno, Gorbachev and Yeltsin would be in the lowest circle. But the point is that the image of the US amongst all these like post-Soviet leaders as being this immortal presence that just has to turn up and wave the stars and stripes and the bad old Russians just crumble to dust. Well, I can understand why many thought that. I mean, let's be clear. Some were paid to think that. I think Saakashvili was probably paid to think that. But I also think he genuinely believed it. And he genuinely believed it because if you think about what happened in the Soviet collapse, like, yes, we're all familiar. We've gone over this many times about the problems in the Soviet Union by the early 1980s. There certainly were problems there, caused by largely the pro-capitalist tendencies in the Soviet Party and an inability of the revolutionaries in the Soviet Party to reassert some element of control and to stop the slide into oblivion. We won't rehash all of that now. But I will make the case, and the more I study this, the more I am convinced of this, that there was no reason why the Soviet Union had to collapse by 85. There was no reason that was inevitable. Literally, like, there were many other ways things could have gone by 85. In fact, the situation was recoverable as late as 88, I would say. But it would have taken some harsh measures, which few people in the leadership positions were prepared to take. Liberalism had rotted them. However, if you're observing that as like someone like Saakashvili did, as a younger man, and if you're observing that from 87 to 91, the Soviet system, when confronted with the image, again, image over reality, of the United States waving the stars and stripes and Ronald Reagan going, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and then the wall comes down. I mean, this is the narrative the US built, that the US challenged communism and communism crumbled into dust, you know? So, and it's a narrative that's backed up by all the, by even the official propaganda in the period where Yakovlev had control over this. So that people like, for people like Saakashvili and others like him who grew up in that time, literally believing that the US just had to, wave the old stars and stripes and the bad man Putin would go running for the hills. I can't say that they were drawing an entirely incorrect conclusion, because based on these people's life experience, that was what looked like had happened in the 80s. Like, the Soviet Union went from being like this incredibly powerful, technologically advanced country in 84, 85 to crumbling into dust by 91. And with the lie being sold that this was all because of like the heroic actions of Reagan and George H.W. Bush. So I can see why a moron like Saakashvili would believe that. How, of course, this meant that he'd never properly studied the history of his own country, the history of the collapse of the USSR or anything else. But you can see why the image was believed. And of course, the image then hits the reality, which is that the Russian Federation still has the capacity to completely destroy the continental United States, which does tend to sober most US politicians up rather quickly. And so Saakashvili found that he was literally standing out there with his dick twisting in the wind, and looking rather stupid, as you do. So this is when he ends up eating his tie on Georgian television. But the end of the 2008 war, of course, marks a dramatic turn, because it was really obvious what the US was up to in Georgia, and it's a key moment in the development of or the degeneration of relations between the Russian Federation and the US imperialists. You'd already had a turn in the form of Putin's 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, and then you had another turn following the war, instigated by Saakashvili at the urging on of the United States. And so now we come up to the period after that war, and this is where we get to the history of somebody like of Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream. Now, Georgian Dream is a bit of a sort of it's a party founded by, of course, a Georgian bourgeois in this guy Ivanishvili. Now, Ivanishvili is a guy with a very checkered past. He was a guy who made his money selling personal computers, actually, both in Georgia, but he did a lot of his business activities in the Russian Federation in the 90s. And so it's a bit of a laugh when you see like people saying, oh, he's pro-Russian, he's pro-Putin. Ivanishvili fled the Russian Federation in 2002, just after Putin was elected for the first time, and actually took up French citizenship before finally making his way back to Georgia later on. So Ivanishvili, to describe him as a Putin ally is erroneous in the extreme. He's a crooked oligarch who, of course, did a lot of business in Russia, but did a lot of business in Russia in the Yeltsin period, not in the Putin period. But he comes back and basically pulls together a political party now known as Georgian Dream, which is variously credited as both liberal, conservative, nationalistic, reactionary, progressive, many different things. Seems to be a sort of coalition of various different groups, which has successfully pulled together, I would say, various different sentiments in Georgia, who, for a variety of reasons, have rejected what I would call the Saakashvili path. Now, Ivanishvili is a bit of an interesting figure because, again, he's been making confessions recently about the war in 2008 and who was ultimately responsible for it. And it would seem that he and the others, senior leaders of the Georgian Dream Party, including Kobakidze, the prime minister, want to put Georgia more in a balanced position. Now, this is, of course, what it would seem that Shevardnadze wanted to do, but was incapable of doing it. And it must also be emphasized that even though the Georgian intelligentsia, again, so-called intelligentsia, is basically a paid-for appendage of the US empire, there are over a million, it would seem, Georgians. There are certainly many, many hundreds of thousands of Georgians who always rejected this path. I mean, I need to do need to see a full breakdown of the voting, but there are hundreds of thousands of people who never wanted to go down the pro-EU, pro-NATO path. This is something which is overwhelmingly popular in the middle class, so-called intelligentsia, certain elements of the Georgian ruling class. But amongst a great majority of Georgians, especially older Georgians from the rural areas, and I think significant elements of the Georgian working class, this has always been rejected. And the Georgian Dream's success, it seems to me, their success in pulling together electoral majorities seems to be based on that they've managed to get to the point where they can pull together the disparate groups that reject the wholly pro-Western route and pull them together, which is why, of course, much like someone like Vucic in Serbia, their their political platform seems to me, looking at this from the outside, to be rather all over the place. But they are consistent in wanting to avoid getting pulled into wholly into the US orbit, and seek to maintain a somewhat independent course. Recently, they've been talking about wanting to resolve finally the status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and for them, it makes complete sense to do so. And also, there were comments by, I think, both Kobakidze made some comments on this, and Ivanishvili did, about the promises and threats that were made about entering the war, entering the war on behalf of the NATO side when it comes to the special military operation. There were apparently promises and threats being made behind the scenes to Georgian politicians that if they opened up a second front against the Russians in, say, South Ossetia, that the US and the EU would, quote, have their back. And when this was questioned by the Georgians as to saying, well, the Russian army will flatten us in a couple of days, what are we going to do then? Apparently the response was, well, don't worry about that, you can wage a guerrilla war. So that just, first of all, let's just ask, does that statement accord with reality? Is that something that we can believe a Western politician saying? Well, yes, it is. Completely it is. This is absolutely something that they would say. It is absolutely something that they would do. They would see Georgia as a pawn on a chessboard, that if they can briefly inconvenience their opponent in deploying it, doesn't matter if the pawn gets taken and the country gets destroyed. We've inconvenienced the Russians for a week or a month. So just does not matter to them how many Ukrainians, or indeed how many Georgians, are fed into this particular meat grinder, as long as the grinder continues. And so, yes, I do believe that the account coming from Kobakidze and others, I think this particularly came probably from a US or a British politician, that they would say something like that they would make that rather wretched offer. So now, of course, we come to the elections, where Georgian Dream, again, like they keep saying that they are committed to the European path, but I somewhat doubt that the European path will be available to them much longer. But they have come out on top in this election. And to be honest, if you go and consult the opinion polls inside Georgia, like Georgian Dream, again, they have clearly been successful in pulling together and maintaining their coalition, because they remained above the 40% mark in most polls all the way through. Like the median line goes from like around about the 50% mark to around about the 42% mark. And whereas the opposition coalitions are just nowhere near them in all of the internal polls going up to this point. So the final result was in line with the internal polling, and even stuff done by like Western polling companies such as Edison. So final results, with 99% of the votes counted, is that Georgian Dream ended up with 89 seats. The main opposition party, or coalition party, ended up with 19. That's the I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of this, but it's roughly translated, in fact, as Coalition for Change, which is the broad pro-EU coalition. And Georgian Dream got over 1 million votes. The main opposition coalition, got 229,000. Another broadly pro-Western coalition called Unity got 211,000 votes. So what you've ended up with is, again, in line with the polls. And then the OSCE and the others started screaming about violations. But they couldn't really say what violations actually had taken place. And you end up with ludicrous characters like this Georgian president, Salome Zurabashvili, who, lest we forget, Zurabashvili is a French citizen, or was a French citizen. She grew up in France, worked for the French government, and was literally French ambassador to Georgia before becoming a Georgian citizen and then assuming the presidency. So she's a literal colonial administrator brought in from France to essentially try to run Georgia for them, or try to essentially manipulate things in Georgia for them. Now, she did a ludicrous interview recently where she was trying to prove the existence of electoral interference. And I will share this for you now because it is absolutely hysterical. This is on the Lord Bebo channel.
It's always very hard to demonstrate. No country has been able to demonstrate, not even the United States, when there were Russian interferences in their elections, nor other European countries. So we are not going to be in the position to demonstrate more than countries that are much stronger to demonstrate the hybrid attacks that they are under. But what is important is not to demonstrate outside, is what the Georgian population knows, feels, and has seen, because who else can see more what is happening in the country, in the villages, than the Georgian population.
Did you hear that, everybody? We can't provide any proof. We can't tell you how the Russian interference has taken place or how the election has been stolen, but just trust me, bro. Trust me, bro. We know. And I did love her incredibly thick Georgian accent. You know, I think that's the region of Georgia that's actually a suburb of Paris that she's expressing there. So the pro EU, pro US side can't say how the elections were rigged. They just feel as if they were. And then you get the statements from like Tony Blinken and the EU officialdom that now Georgia is rejecting democracy, or there's a democracy is at threat, because democracy to them in reality is just basically just means what we say it is. Democracy is when we get the right result. That's democratic, because we, as in the US, we are the ultimate expression of all things democratic, meaning that anything outside of our interests cannot possibly be democratic, because we are the universal subject. We are the makers of history. You know, this whole absolutely soaked in racism and chauvinism attitude that all of the Western leaders have, expressed by Blinken, expressed by Joseph Borrell in his comments about the EU as a beautiful garden and we need to keep the jungle out of it. Whereas I think at best all the Georgians could expect, if they were allowed into the garden, was to probably work as very low-paid gardeners. But the point is that this hysterical denunciation of Russian influence is, a lot of this is projection, because if you actually look at the Russian soft power game over the last 20 years, since in Putin's time, certainly, the Russian soft power game's been crap, largely, in many places. Like, you compare that the soft power operations, the cultural influencing operations of the Russians with those of the US and the British, especially, and the French and the Germans. Russians have done little to nothing in terms of cultural influencing operations. In fact, I mean, I've made this comment before, that for all Putin's professions of faith in Russian orthodoxy, he sometimes does behave like a very vulgar materialist. And the Russian point of view seems to be that because Georgia is so close and it can't really avoid economic ties with Russia, that ultimately the economic ties will be stronger than the cultural ties. Now, it's true that there has been a lot of US money going into Georgia. There have been US corporations being active in Georgia. But in terms of trade, the US and EU side is far behind the trade with Russia and the growing trade with China as well. And of course, the trade with Turkey. So it's, of course, a neighboring state. But Russia just hasn't run on anything like the same scale of cultural influencing operations as the US EU side has done. So when you see Zurabashvili, Madame Zurabashvili, complaining there that there's all this Russian interference, but we can't tell you what it is and you can't see it, and the US can't even see how the Russians are interfering. That's how good they are. This is like complete like projection stuff, because no one has interfered more inside Georgia over the last 30 years than the US and their European allies. Like, it's a complete projection operation. And as for her claim that, well, you can't see it, but we feel it. I mean, a lot of these people are so far gone on their own hype, a lot of these like pro-US people, that they actually imagine, they can't imagine how anybody could possibly reject the wonderful world of the US sphere, of the EU sphere. We had a little bit of this ourselves, and not on the same scale, but like when we went through the Brexit thing, like the people who were really pro-EU in this country, who tend to be from the labor aristocracy and petty bourgeoisie in the most part, they literally could not imagine and could not comprehend the arguments against the EU, especially those who identify themselves as being progressive. They certainly couldn't understand a Marxist argument against the EU, and they couldn't understand how anybody could reject it. And they quickly devolved into really bitter, like ranting and raving and like genocidal impulses very, very quickly, because their beloved EU membership had been taken away from them. Like, there's literally like people like wishing death on like all the ignorant, poverty-stricken masses who voted against the EU, and you see the same impulses being expressed by some of the paid agents of the EU in Georgia. Now, they immediately descend into screaming and wishing death upon their opponents, and basically just reveal the liberal mask comes off and the fascist underneath comes out as soon as they're frustrated. Now, the Zurabashvili has called for demonstrations, and there have been large-scale demonstrations against the result held in Tbilisi. Weirdly enough, Viktor Orban turned up in Tbilisi and congratulated the Georgian Dream government on its victory, saying he was sure that they would continue to progress to the EU. I think Orban basically is going over there and is now in an extended period of trolling the EU leadership. But it's interesting that he went over there. Basically, it seems to be... Basically, Orban is an interesting figure because he's obviously a guy who emerged via US-sponsored networks and ultimately ended up, if not turning on them, then having the US and the Germans turn on him and having to respond. So it's not a surprise, perhaps, that he's ended up going over there and stirring things up. But in terms of the Georgian Dream government, I mean, they've faced these demonstrations before, and they do seem to have learnt an important lesson from the Ukrainian situation, and going all the way back to the Serbian and Yugoslav color revolutions of over 20 years ago, 24 years ago now, which is that when faced with these, basically what you need to do is to keep your nerve and wait them out, which is that a lot of these mobilizations are, again, it's limited in terms of its actual numbers. I mean, you can make a decent sized crowd look much more impressive than it actually is by getting them all to congregate around the parliament in Tbilisi, for instance. But the important thing for a government to do is to not panic. And what you're seeing now with with Georgian Dream is the effect of, well, the cumulative effect of the Russian special military operation and what has happened to Ukraine in even a crook like Ivanishvili. And Ivanishvili, let's not make any bones about this, is a crook, but he's not a stupid crook. which is he is able to see, and Kobakidze is able to see what has happened in Ukraine, and don't want to find themselves on the receiving end of that. And also that the West has been revealed to be an emperor with no clothes. The naked emperor has failed in Ukraine, didn't turn up to save its proxies, won't turn up to save its proxies, and now you have the major proxy in West Asia, which is Israel, visibly failing against Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. So Western power is shaking and is falling to pieces bit by bit. And so as this happens, even crooked bastards like Ivanishvili will look at this and think, I don't fancy this bet anymore. I'd better be more careful, which is that I need to keep a route open to the Russians, and I need to keep a route open to the Chinese. And what's going to happen is that, I mean, this is where I will get into the prediction territory here, that I predict that the Georgian Dream government will probably wait out these demonstrations. There'll be a lot of screaming and hysteria and running around. They will try and wait it out. There will be all kinds of US and European politicians turning up in Tbilisi. I mean, if I were in charge, I wouldn't let the fuckers in. But the Georgians seem determined to Georgian Dream is still a coalition. There's still some very soft, very squishy elements of that who are still pro-EU. So they'll probably still allow all these EU politicians to come over there, scream and jump up and down. But waiting things out is not a bad strategy. Don't panic. Don't allow things to be escalated. I mean, there was talk yesterday of snipers being brought in by the US to operate in Georgia. Well, I would say that is something that, of course, the US has a track record of doing. We know, thanks to investigations into what happened in Romania in 1989, that this is something that the US did to stir up the demonstration and push it in a violent direction. They deployed snipers via the Romanian reactionaries to kill large numbers of people and blame it on Ceausescu. They did the same thing again in Ukraine, Kiev, 2014. Again, the work of Professor Ivan Kachanovsky has revealed that the shots came from buildings controlled by Ukrainian fascist formations. So that they would try and do the same thing in Tbilisi now should not be a surprise. Because if the demonstration looks like it's petering out, if it looks like the government is able to successfully control the situation, what do you do if you're the US? Well, stir things up, deploy some snipers, kill a load of people in the demonstration, which is what they did in Kiev. Stir things up further. So I wouldn't be surprised if they tried something like that, because they are getting desperate. Because if this fails and the Georgian Dream government continues on the path that it's on, which is essentially looking to rebuild relations with Russia, then what will happen is that the EU road, the NATO road, will get sealed off. And it'll get sealed off partly because they'll dump loads more sanctions on Georgia, which will ultimately make the EU far less popular, which will ultimately strengthen the position of those who are anti-EU and anti-NATO. So this is probably their last shot at like bringing Georgia firmly into the US camp, or doing an Armenia on it. And so we should not underestimate the ruthlessness of these criminals in the US and in the EU, and what they are prepared to do to destabilize a country. And this is something that I'm sure an increasing number of Georgians understand. What has essentially been done to their country since 1991 is that you have a whole layer of so-called intellectuals and media figures in Georgia who are actively destroyed to actively work against and to destroy their own country for the purposes of US imperialism. That's what's been done. That's what was done in Ukraine. It's what's been done in the Baltic states. It's what was done in the former Yugoslavia. You have large numbers of people who are paid to act as wholly destructive influences. Now, part of that, of course, is that they are resident within the capitalist class itself. Georgian capitalist class isn't exactly up to much. But you have a wider layer within the petty bourgeoisie and even people who are brought up from the working class to work as essentially foreign agents, which is why they all went apeshit over that foreign agents registration bill. And again, it revealed just the complete contempt that the imperialists have for a country like Georgia when it tries to do things that the imperialists themselves insist have to happen in their own countries. Like in the US, you have to routinely register as a foreign agent if you're doing work on behalf of another government. Of course, that doesn't stop a whole lot of corruption in the US, but if you're doing work for a government who the US is hostile to, they'll certainly take action against you. But literally what the US and the EU are saying to the Georgians is, you don't get to decide what goes on in your country. We do. And don't you dare try to restrict our activities. Otherwise, we'll call you undemocratic, which is such a laugh when you consider it. The tragic thing is that so many Georgians actually bought this argument and bought the bullshit that the EU and the US was selling. So we now, I'll come to a pause in just a moment. We'll come back and cover this later in the week to see how it develops. But I would say I think that the Georgian Dream government will probably survive. They seem like the history is flowing in their direction. If this was 10 years ago, this would have been a lot more difficult. But the damage to US power and influence has been very great over the last few years. The visible losses that Ukraine has endured and the inability of the US to stop the Russians on the battlefield has severely damaged their power. And so it makes it easier for a government, even one as with a sort of rather mixed coalition as Georgian Dream has, to actually push in a more independent direction. And for that reason, we should hope that the Georgian government survives this latest scare and this latest attempt to get rid of it, and that they can see the back of the French woman, Zurabashvili, and proceed in a more independent direction, because that would be the dismantling of US power can only be good in terms of the re-emergence of a free workers' movement in Georgia. Because of what's happened over the last 30 years is that the workers' movement in Georgia, it's from looking at this over the last few days, you've seen that the trade union and workers' movement has become influenced by the deeply compromised trade union federations in Europe and, of course, the AFL-CIA. So for the emergence of a workers' movement that is independent of foreign influence, it's important for the current course to be maintained. Because you can't have any hope at like a working class power breaking out when all of the working class, supposedly working class organizations, are dominated by foreign agents and run by people who are in the pay of US imperialism. So for all those reasons, even a crooked bastard like Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream Group, if they push in this direction of slowly removing the huge influence that the US and the Europeans have built up, or if the US and the Europeans have a fit and pull out themselves, then that can only be good for the development of working class politics in Georgia. Right, okay, so we are now at the hour and 20 mark, going to go back up to questions, etc. So, hello to various people who are tuning in. Nush, 82, Potted Rodent, Working Prole, Svetlana, who says, as in Ukraine in recent years, school textbooks in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan have been edited to feature anti-USSR and anti-Russian BS. One feels the hand of Washington and London behind all this. Certainly, they will have an influence in that. I mean, the Central Asian states are a bit of an oddity, but you can see like the conflict that's going on there, because Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other places, Kyrgyzstan. Certainly in Kazakhstan, there's a lot of British influence. I mean, there was major British investment in Kazakhstan over many, many years, so that they would have an influence there is not a surprise. But of course, the Central Asian countries are pulled in two directions at the same time. you have the anti-Russian, anti-Soviet elements there, who are making their play, but also you've got the fact that the Central Asian states do an absolute shitload of business with the Russians, and for all that the US and the British are making their plays in these countries, they can't match the level of business that the Central Asian countries do with the Russians. And so this creates a rather awkward situation. I mean, the Central Asian countries are all run by basically parasitic oligarchies, much of which are rather unstable. Like Tokayev had to be secured in position by a Russian military intervention to get rid of the influence of Nursultan Nazarbayev, his predecessor. So it's a very contradictory situation in Central Asia. One can only hope that the influence of America and Britain is pushed out of all of these places. But I wouldn't rely on any of these leaders in Central Asia at the moment doing that. But the increasing amount of business they're doing with Russia, is that going to push the US influence out? Well, again, I would say that the Russian government's being far too crudely materialist about this. They think that by just continually increasing the amount of business that they're doing there, that this will somehow right the situation in the end. But what they don't seem to understand is that in the short to medium term, the British and the US can do an awful lot of damage to Russia in Central Asia, and I wouldn't be surprised if they made some more aggressive plays there in the coming years, given how crucial the Central Asian trade routes are for Russia. So we'll have to see how that goes. I'm interested to see the emergence of, or the re-emergence of, communist parties in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and the other Central Asian countries, though I don't know enough about those. Hello to Daniel, who's joining us, and hello to Jessica, and Arnold, and Stephen, and Lertis. And be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Comrade Jason, good morning to you. Working Prole says that you are apparently listening at a construction site in Austria. Well, good to have you with us, keeping you company on your working morning. Good evening to S, who apparently is joining us from somewhere on the other side of the world. Hello to Tim Gray. Hello to Anthony, who's joining us for Daytime Socialist Television. Yes, coming up next, cooking slot, how to cook socialist dishes. Good evening to Bob, who joins us from the US vassal state of Australia. Hello to Tim Gray. And hello to Harry. And we're going through the comments. Hello to Rista Kostadinov, who says, when I was interested in whatever the fuck libertarianism is, I remember watching Reason TV and they were glazing Saakashvili, how he magically made Georgia developing. I'm still waiting to see developed. By developed, they just mean basically he agreed to privatize loads of shit and basically allow more asset stripping. That's what libertarianism basically comes down to. Aziz says, I don't know if this is true, but someone said there is one NGO for every 100 people in Georgia. I'm not sure of the exact number. It's certainly a lot, though. And they're not even particularly hiding that. Nush says the same problem of growing influence of NGOs seems to be spreading in the Central Asian republics as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact situation there, but I imagine they will be dramatically upping their operations there. Are the Central Asian republics capable of reaching a sensible decision? It's more likely to be the case now. It's more likely to be the case that the operations of the US and the British will fail in Central Asia if the result in Ukraine comes out the way that it's clearly it's obvious to me that it's going to go in the way of a total Russian victory now. So the ability of the US and the British to weave their influence in these countries is going to be limited. What's crucial, though, more than anything else, is that the communist parties in these countries re-emerge more strongly. and re-emerge in such a way as to be rooted in the working classes of the Central Asian republics, but also in such a way as to as to draw people away from the temptations of these NGOs, because these are only offering a dead end to people, and people get involved with these networks sometimes for corrupt reasons, sometimes just because they want to make money, but sometimes it's because of legitimate frustrations. So, like, to living in the oligarchic run countries like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan can be, I would imagine, a frustrating experience for many people, dealing with that amount of the amount of glaring and obvious corruption that goes on, a few oligarchs grabbing up everything. So, and given that there's not a strong working class presence there in terms of organized working class, that there's not a communist party there that does much, as far as I can tell. I know that there are some, but they're rather limited. All of the opposition networks are dominated by NGOs, or it can be in some cases. It's easy to see why some people get drawn into it, whose motivations aren't just crudely materialistic, or like motivated by what I would call cringing before the West. Some of it does come from real sources of frustration, which get appropriated by the NGOs and manipulated in the interest of the US. But a communist movement's re-emerging again and becoming stronger, that is the only real cure for this. Relying on the local oligarchies to make the right decisions, or make decisions that are going to benefit the Uzbek or Kazakh worker, is not a winning strategy. Hello to Even Sten, who's coming to us from occupied Sweden. Best Cold War propaganda film was Rocky. Well, you say Rocky 5, it's Rocky 4 when he's fighting Ivan Drago. Yeah, that's hilarious. There's a new cut of that film that Stallone did recently, where he cut out the bizarre bits, like the bit with the robot. It's a good film. It's a good propaganda movie. I even enjoyed Creed 2, where, of course, Dolph Lundgren comes back into it again. Apparently, the US did send 3 Coast Guard boats to Georgia in 2008. I'm sure that makes all the difference. Working Prol says, when Alexander swears about the liberal degens, he reminds me of a Slav. Are you sure you're British? Who knows? Maybe there's a hidden Slavic side to the family that I don't know about. Who knows? But I thank you for the compliment, comrade. Just scrolling through the comments here. Aziz says, apparently Georgia also passed a defense of family law to keep the LGBTQ perversion out of the country. Well, let's be clear. They're not. You can pass the laws, but there's still going to be people out there doing engaging in, should we say, same-sex activity. So you're not going to stop that kind of thing. I think what's happened is that again, this is how the West just destroys everything that even has progressive content to it. Like the idea that consenting adults should be prosecuted for sexual activity, that's not good, and it was a positive thing in Britain when the legal prescribing of same-sex relationships was removed. The problem is that along with everything else that happened in that period, because this was a liberal reform that happened in the period of decaying imperialism picked that up and turned it into a means of propaganda, and tried to turn homosexuals and lesbians in these countries that were targets of color revolutionary operations into basically centers of intellectual power on behalf of US imperialism. And it doesn't do gays in these countries any good whatsoever if it associates you with a hated foreign manipulator, then whatever NGO's running a supposedly gay-friendly agenda is going to do you fuck all good whatsoever. Like, it's the appropriation of all of this, the what I would call the liberal struggles of the 1960s by the US just shows how easily capitalism was able to accommodate all of those and to appropriate them. Daniel says, sounds like just like the opposition in Venezuela. Yes, fair point. Western liberals are blinded by their arrogance, says Harry. That's true. T.G. Wilson says, in 1981, Claire Sterling published The Terror Network, filled with CIA bullshit about Russia, condemning Russia for its support for international terrorism. The same year, the El Junquillo and El Mazote terror operations took place, leading to a decade of U.S. terrorism against Central America. Hundreds of thousands killed. Sterling worked for the CIA cutout overseas news agency. As Alex pointed out, nothing has changed. When they are engaged in terrorism, they project it onto others. Yeah, this was the big thing in the 80s, was that the accusation that the Soviets were behind an international terror network. In reality, it was the US that was. The Soviets had very little to do with like Red Army faction in Germany or the Red Brigades in Italy. It had very little to do with them. They had much more to do, well, Red Army faction had a bit to do with the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The Soviets didn't have much to do with them at all. The US were very much running whole terror networks in, as T.G. Wilson points out, Central America, the West Asia, Central Asia, pretty much everywhere. All the Gladio operations in Europe, all the stuff run by the United States. And T.G. Wilson adds, in 2006, a massive study came out on El Salvador, confirming that the lies the US used to justify their death squad carnage, blaming connections to the USSR, was all bullshit, all complete garbage. Yeah, all complete shite. Jessica Fitz says, Trump likes Orban. Yeah, Trump does, but Orban's a far smarter man than Trump. He actually understands how power works. Trump doesn't. T.G. Wilson says, Milakovsky, that's Netanyahu, has had at least 3 names and studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Yeah, wasn't he? Hasn't he? He's gone under his real name, which is Milakovsky. He's been under Netanyahu, Natali, I think, and at least one other in the US. I mean, the guy's a US intelligence operative. He has been for years. Pretty obvious when you start looking into his history. "23,000 Americans currently in the Israeli occupation force. Maybe time to call them the American occupation force." Yeah, just call them what they are, which is a US colonial force, because that's who ultimately runs the show. Yes, Mr. Kostadinov, we are actually covering Moldova this week. That'll be, I might do that tomorrow morning. Might start doing one in the morning, one in the evening, given how much there is to cover at the moment. These propaganda exercises are not a patch on Red Dawn, says Lurtis. That's true. Video ideas, Congo, Ethiopia, free economic zones in the UK. The economic, the free ports, etc. in Britain, I'm writing something on that. So I will come back to it. Congo, yeah, I've had like 4 or 5 books on Congo sitting on the drive here, unread for a while. So yeah, I do need to go and do something on that. It would be a very interesting series to do. Mr. Kostadinov says, even the PFLP were given the side eye to the RAF because of how adventurous they are. Yeah, very true. All right, so 338 of you watching right now. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. We will be back at 7:30 this evening for the second show of the day. where we'll be covering the West Asian situation. So everything to do with the war in occupied Palestine and Lebanon, Iran, etc. And I'll be back to talk about that again this evening. Please do be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And also, thank you to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Audio uploads will be done later today on Patreon. Again, I will be updating the schedule for future shows to take place later this week. So, thank you everybody for tuning in. Be sure to join me again in the evening. But until then, have a good day, and I'll see you later on.